Hi everyone, Mrs. Davis here to talk about changes in population size. So now that we know what a population is, it's a group of organisms that are of the same species that live in the same area and interact with one another. And population size can change by small amounts or large amounts depending on what's going on in that habitat at that time. And we're going to look at some of those changes today. So increases and decreases in population, there are two main ways that a population can increase, and that would be through births or immigration, moving into a population. So immigration is when you're entering a population, and that would of course add to the population, and then you have births, which would add to the population. Population can decrease in two ways. Obviously, deaths will decrease the population, as well as emigration. Emigration is when you are leaving a population or moving out of that population. So we have death and emigration decreasing our population size, and birth and immigration increasing our population size. The population statement, it sounds a little wonky at first, but we can simplify it easily. It just says that if your birth rate is greater than your death rate, then population size will increase. That makes sense. If there are more births than death, then we will increase our population size. Conversely, if our death rate is greater than our birth rate, then our population size is going to decrease, which makes sense. If we have more deaths than births, then our population will decrease. Population growth. So population growth can be measured in two ways. There is exponential growth and there is logistic growth. So exponential growth is going to be unrestricted. It's not something that's controlled. It's a constantly increasing based off of a certain multiple. So maybe it's increasing 10 times every minute. And it will remain at that constant rate throughout time. So an example of this would be bacteria, where double their population size every 20 minutes. So in the beginning, if you start with one bacteria, then 20 minutes later you have 2 bacteria. And then another 20 minutes you have 4 bacteria. But it doesn't sound like something that would increase all that quickly, but think about when you get to 100 bacteria, and then in the next 20 minutes you have 200 bacteria. So it's something that can get away from you pretty quickly. And there's a video here that kind of goes over how exponential growth works and gives you a good visualization of exponential growth related to sitting in a hockey rink. So give that a look. Logistic growth is restricted. So logistic growth isn't going to go on forever like exponential growth, which is unrestricted. Logistic growth is restricted by what's called carrying capacity, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically that is the cap or the lid on population size. We cannot go higher than the carrying capacity. And with logistic growth, there's no overall increase or decrease in the population size. So it's just going to kind of hover between a certain amount. Here we see exponential growth curves versus logistic growth curves. So you can see with exponential, it kind of starts out slow and then it all of a sudden just goes crazy and increases throughout time. Whereas logistic growth is also kind of slow to begin with, but steady increase. And then at a certain point, we're going to start to decrease because we've reached our carrying capacity, which basically means that there are factors out there in an environment that simply will not let the environment increase population. So at a certain point, you run out of resources for your population, and all that can happen is your population decreases until those resources build back up, and then your population can increase again. So it kind of ends up looking like an up and down loop. Basically, just to recap, exponential growth will exceed carrying capacity because it does not have any way of checking itself, and logistic growth will taper out. All right, this is a video explaining limiting factors. I'll let you guys watch this on your own, but I will go over some limiting factors in the next slide. So a limiting factor is an environmental factor that causes a population to decrease in size. So some examples of limiting factors could be the food supply, the water supply, lack of space, weather conditions, predators, and disease. These are all things that will control how high a population can get. So limiting factors can be broken into two categories. We have density dependent limiting factors, and we also have density independent limiting factors. So density dependent limiting factors means that they are dependent upon how dense the population is. So it's going to limit population more as the population increases. So as our population increases, our food supply becomes smaller. That's our density dependent limiting factor. So examples could be food, disease. Obviously, you're going to be more able to spread disease if you are in closer quarters with a higher population density. Water supply, space, shelter. You know, a lot of organisms have to fight for their habitat space. It's running low as humans encroach upon that. So that would be a population density dependent factor. And sunlight. So depending on, that might seem like a density independent factor, but if you think about a forest and you are a tiny tree trying to grow up in a large lush forest, you're going to struggle to get sunlight because all the other trees are keeping you in the shade. Density independent limiting factors. So these are factors that it doesn't matter how big your population is, but it can still take out some of your population no matter how big the population is or how small it is. So they're going to have the same effect regardless of population size. That could be fires, floods, habitat destruction, extreme weather events. So a lot of things that deal with climate change and also human impact. But also things that just can kind of happen randomly and keep lower population in that regard. So COVID-19, do we think this is a density dependent or density independent limiting factor? Because it is something that unfortunately decreases population size. So COVID-19 would be density dependent because if you are in a denser region and that would allow the virus to spread more quickly and affect more people, as we saw, when we didn't know much about it in New York. So cities were highly affected by COVID-19 originally and continue to be, but that would be because they have a higher density population. All right, carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, like we said, is kind of the lid on population size. It's going to cap the number of individuals that can exist in an environment. And this is based off of the long term. So yeah, we could have an exponential growth in our population, and that could really take off. But at some point, we are going to reach our carrying capacity and return to that logistic growth curve where we increase and then decrease. So that would be the max population. So if I look at this box truck that's completely full, there's no more space, so I know my carrying capacity must be 14 boxes. And the limiting factor that keeps that in check is space. So whereas some limiting factors might include a water shortage, and that determines your carrying capacity, just in this simple example, it is space that's the limiting factor. And you can certainly have more than one limiting factor controlling growth. So that is it for studying changes in population size. Please complete the notes, and then when you are finished, you have the Studying Population Dynamics Part 2 to complete. just a couple of questions asking you about the material that you've learned today. Please reach out if you have any questions. Have a great day.